Late autumn was when I took the overnight security shift at a regional distribution warehouse outside a mid-sized city. I was 43, recently divorced, and I'd transferred out of a daytime facilities role because nights felt simpler, fewer conversations, fewer expectations. The building sat off a service road that paralleled the interstate. After midnight, the world reduced itself to semis, distant tires, and the steady rhythm of work that was happening somewhere else. If you want more realistic, quietly unsettling accounts like this, subscribe and I'll share the ones that still feel true to me. My sedan stayed parked under sodium vapor lights that hummed faintly above the loading docks. Every hour, on the hour, I walked the perimeter, swept cameras, and wrote clean, boring log entries. At 2:15 a.m., I made coffee and watched dock door number 12, the one with the dented lower panel, like it was a landmark. Staffing shortages meant one guard per shift, and I didn't mind. Solitude wasn't a hardship for me then, it was a relief. My job was practical. Confirm doors were sealed, note trailer numbers, watch for anything that could turn into a claim later. Injury, theft, damage, fire. I treated it like a checklist, because checklists keep you honest. Corporate had recently upgraded motion sensors along the east fence line. It was the first week after installation, so minor calibration issues were expected. The vendor's notes said wind could trigger false positives until sensitivity was tuned. Cold air slipped under the dock seals whenever the wind shifted, and I told myself that was all the night would be. Air and machinery and paperwork. On my tablet, the east fence zone was labeled Sector E3. At 1:07 a.m., Sector E3 flagged a brief motion alert. The tablet vibrated once, a soft insistence in my hand. I pulled up the nearest camera feed and watched chain link and weeds in grainy monochrome. Nothing moved except the suggestion of wind. No headlights. No figure. No vehicle on the shoulder of the service road. I listened to the camera's audio for a moment and heard a faint metallic rattle, like loose wire tapping steel in a steady breeze. It sounded normal enough to dismiss. I wrote it down as a false trigger and didn't leave the office. The alert had lasted 4 seconds, which fit the pattern of a sensor waking and calming. That was how I filed it in my head, mechanical, predictable, solved. The next night, it happened again between 1:05 and 1:10. Then again the night after that. The time stayed close enough to feel like coincidence, but consistent enough to be a nuisance. Each clip showed the same empty perimeter. Chain link, weeds, the dark shape of the interstate embankment beyond. No pedestrians, no cars stopping, nothing that matched the word motion. By the third night, I stopped relying on cameras alone. When E3 triggered, I went outside and stood where the dock lights ended and the lot fell off into shadow. The air smelled like diesel and damp concrete. The east fence looked undisturbed. No bent links, no fresh footprints, no trash caught in the wire. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror, give this a like. On the fourth night, after an alert ended, I noticed dock number 12's exterior light flicker. Just once, a quick dip and return, exactly as the tablet stopped vibrating. I wrote it down because it was a real thing I could point to, and because my logbook had started to repeat itself. E3, negative visual confirmation. I'm not the kind of person who trusts a feeling without checking it against something. So I pulled the recordings and played them side by side, the E3 alerts and dock number 12's camera. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was looking for wiring issues, power dips, anything explainable. The flicker wasn't random. It aligned with every alert, as if one event caused the other. At 1 hour 7 minutes and 14 seconds, E3 triggered. At 1 hour 7 minutes and 14 seconds, the dock light dipped. The next night, the same. It was precise in a way that made my stomach tighten, without giving me a reason. Before my 1 a.m. round, I felt a restrained hesitation, physical, not emotional, like my body had noticed a pattern before my mind accepted it. I considered calling maintenance. Then I told myself one more verification would make the call cleaner. At 1:06 a.m., I positioned myself midway between dock number 12 and the east fence line. I didn't stand under the light. I stood where the edge of illumination faded, so I could see both directions without glare. My tablet was in my left hand. My flashlight was in my right. The lot was empty except for the slow idle of refrigerated trailers in the distance, a steady mechanical breath. When E3 triggered, the tablet vibrated once, and dock number 12's exterior light cut out completely. Not a flicker. A clean blackout that turned that stretch of dock into a darker shape inside the night. In the darkness, I heard footsteps on gravel, measured, deliberate, inside the fence line, not outside. The sound was close enough to make the hair at the base of my neck lift, but not close enough to locate with certainty. I took a step toward it, then stopped when I realized the pacing wasn't approaching or retreating. It was moving parallel to me, matching distance as if something was keeping a careful line. I angled my flashlight low to avoid blinding myself with reflections. The beam caught drifting dust and the texture of gravel, nothing else. The footsteps continued for a few seconds, then ceased exactly when the dock light hummed back on. I didn't run. I stood there, listening to the sudden absence of sound, aware of how quiet a place becomes when machinery is the only life in it. Back in the office, I replayed the camera feed immediately. There was no visible figure, but a faint shadow crossed the ground in the blackout, thin, unassigned, not aligned with mine. I went straight back inside and locked the interior office door, even though it was a hollow gesture in a building built for forklifts and loading bays. I wrote the incident down with more detail than usual, then filed it through the system so it couldn't be brushed off as my imagination later. The report had a number, #4473N, and seeing it on the screen made it feel like something that existed outside my head. I requested a second guard for the remainder of the week. I didn't dramatize it. I framed it as a safety measure during sensor calibration and power irregularities at dock number 12. I also emailed maintenance about the light and asked for a wiring check. Maintenance came during the day and found minor corrosion at dock number 12's fixture. Nothing that explained timing. Corporate replied with a familiar phrase, "Sensor sensitivity, expected false positives, continue monitoring." The heater in the office kicked on with a dull metallic pop that made me flinch anyway. Weeks later, after I'd stopped trying to convince myself it was nothing, I reviewed archived footage again. That was when a smaller detail became impossible to ignore. In one clip, my own shadow fell across the gravel at a known angle, consistent with the dock light's position. But the secondary shadow that crossed during the blackout didn't align with it. It wasn't longer or shorter because of camera distortion. It was wrong in direction, as if cast by a different light source, or by something that wasn't where the light insisted it should be. After I requested backup, the E3 alerts stopped entirely. Dock number 12's light didn't flicker again. No further motion alerts were logged in Sector E3. The radio channel stayed quiet during overnight checks. My assigned backup guard only came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and those nights were always uneventful, as if the presence of a second person changed the rules. I transferred back to a daytime position within 2 months. No one ever confirmed an intruder, and I never claimed there was one. What unsettles me isn't the sound of footsteps or the blank cameras. It's the synchronization, the way the building seemed to coordinate its dark moments around my attention. Something moved only when unobserved by camera, but always within range of me. I still picture dock number 12's dented panel under that sodium glow, and I still wake some nights at 1:07 a.m. without knowing why. Share this with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe if you want the next account the way it actually happened. Midwinter, I was 45 and back on overnight rotation as an MRI technician at a private hospital in a suburban medical complex. I had returned to nights for the pay differential after a separation. The imaging wing shuts down after 11 p.m. Most departments go dark, and the hallways feel longer than they do during the day. My routine was uncomplicated. Prep the rooms, sanitize the coils, confirm contrast supplies, log emergency scans only. MRI Room B was always left in idle mode overnight, the magnet humming steadily behind its shielding. If you prefer realistic accounts told without exaggeration, subscribe and I'll continue sharing them as I remember them. The HVAC airflow echoed softly down the empty radiology corridor, moving air through spaces that no longer held people. That night, the only scheduled scan was a 2:30 a.m. emergency referral. Around midnight, the case was canceled. Policy required that I remain on-site in case trauma intake changed. The security desk sat 2 floors below. No one was assigned specifically to imaging overnight. After prepping MRI Room B and documenting idle status, I reviewed maintenance logs to pass time. The elevator bell chimed occasionally somewhere in the building, distant and hollow, even though no transport requests were active. At 12:14 a.m., I initialed the maintenance checklist confirming coil integrity and table calibration within tolerance. Everything read normal. The magnet's baseline hum was constant, familiar, almost reassuring. At approximately 2:17 a.m., The MRI console displayed a brief alert. Table movement detected. The room was empty. I could see the table through the interior camera feed, centered, stationary, sheet smoothed flat. There was no patient and no pending exam. I assumed a sensor recalibration glitch. The system had undergone firmware updates the previous month. The error code was TM04, which typically indicated sensitivity variance rather than mechanical motion. I reset the alert and documented it. The magnet coil emitted its low electrical hum, unchanged in pitch. I continued charting, aware of the time but not yet unsettled. 2 nights later, at nearly the same time, 2:17 a.m., the alert appeared again. This time, the system log added weight variance detected. The internal camera still showed an empty room. No distortion, no visible displacement. I entered MRI room B to confirm. My rubber soles squeaked faintly against the polished flooring, the sound amplified by the shielded walls. The table looked normal at first glance, but when I checked the console log, it indicated the table had extended 11.2 inches during the alert. It was extended slightly further than I remembered leaving it. I retracted it manually and recalibrated positioning, telling myself memory can be unreliable during night shifts. If you appreciate slow-burn, realistic accounts like this, a like is enough. The following week, the same alert recurred, always at 2:17 a.m., always when I was seated at the console. I began comparing logs across several weeks. The variance increased incrementally each time, fractions of inches, then more. The pattern repeated every third night. Always 2:17 a.m. Always when I was physically outside the room at the console station. That detail stayed with me. I am not prone to speculation, but repetition has its own logic. The magnet's bore creates a blind spot in certain camera angles, an area where depth perception flattens. Before entering the room again on the next scheduled shift, I hesitated in the corridor longer than necessary. The stillness inside the shielded chamber felt heavier than the hallway air. On the next third night, I adjusted my approach. At 2:16 a.m., I remained inside MRI room B with the lights dimmed. I positioned myself against the wall opposite the bore, console tablet in my hand. I wanted to remove distance from the event. At 2:17, the tablet vibrated. Weight detected. I was alone, standing upright, not touching the table. The table began extending outward on its own, slow and mechanical. There was no abrupt jolt, just a deliberate glide driven by the motor assembly. My first thought was remote override malfunction. I stepped back, giving the system space to complete what I assumed was an erroneous command cycle. The console display updated. 183.7 pounds distributed centrally. The disposable sheet on the table depressed gradually, as if weight settled onto it. The indentation formed from the center outward, precise and symmetrical. No visible body, no shift in air, only compression. The mechanical whir of the table motor echoed in the shielded room, amplified by stillness. I pressed the emergency stop. The table halted mid-extension. The weight reading remained steady for several seconds before dropping abruptly to 0. The indentation lingered in the sheet, an outline of pressure, then slowly lifted, fabric rising as though released from beneath. I powered down the scanner immediately, following shutdown protocol rather than reacting impulsively. Fluorescent lights buzzed fully on as the magnet transitioned to safe idle. I contacted biomedical engineering and documented the anomaly under ticket #MR8821. The overnight engineer arrived within the hour. He inspected the table mechanics, recalibrated sensors, reviewed logs. No mechanical faults were identified. Calibration was within tolerance. The weight sensor tested accurately under controlled load. I requested temporary reassignment to CT rotation, framing it as procedural caution following repeated sensor irregularities. Administration approved it without difficulty. The incident was categorized as unverified system anomaly. Weeks later, from a workstation during a daytime shift, I reviewed archived thermal camera footage from that night. At 2:17 a.m., there was a brief fluctuation in air density above the table, subtle, almost imperceptible. It was too faint to confirm as a measurable anomaly. It could have been environmental interference. After my reassignment, the alert stopped. No further weight variance detected, logs appeared. The final recorded anomaly date was January 12th. When I occasionally walked past MRI room B during daylight hours, a cold draft brushed my forearms near the bore opening, though the room temperature was stable. The magnet's hum remained constant, indifferent. I remain in hospital work, but I avoid overnight imaging shifts. I have never described the event as anything specific. I only know the machine recorded consistent weight within a narrow margin at the same time repeatedly. Something aligned itself precisely within the magnet's field, night after night, until I stayed inside the room with it. The hollow quiet inside magnet rooms after midnight is distinct, and 2:17 a.m. remains exact in my memory. If this account felt grounded to you, share it with someone who values restrained horror, and subscribe for the next one told just as carefully. Late summer, I was 42 and supervising an overnight data migration at a corporate office park just outside the city. The IT infrastructure upgrade required weekend night oversight to avoid disrupting weekday operations. By 11 p.m., the cleaning crew finished and the 3-story glass building emptied completely. From the outside, it looked like a dark aquarium reflecting parking lot lights. I worked from the third-floor server room, where climate control never shut off and the cooling fan spun continuously inside tall black racks. If you prefer realistic accounts told without exaggeration, subscribe and I'll continue sharing them as they happened. Server rack C17 sat directly across from my workstation, its amber status light blinking at a steady interval like a patient pulse. The migration had to run uninterrupted from midnight to 5 a.m. My task was simple in theory: monitor transfer integrity, watch for packet loss, and respond to outages before they cascaded. Security patrols circled the building exterior once an hour, but no one else was inside. On the first night, sometime after midnight, I noticed lights activating briefly on the second floor. Through the internal camera feed, motion sensors in conference room 2B clicked on, casting sharp white light across an otherwise empty table. The lights shut off within a minute. There was no badge access logged and no scheduled staff. I assumed a sensor glitch. The clicks of motion lights echoed distinctly in an empty building. At 12:43 a.m., my network map displayed a login attempt from an inactive workstation. The credentials failed immediately. The username attempt read guest admin. That account didn't exist in our environment. I checked the device ID. It mapped to conference room 2B. The workstation there was meant to be powered down except during quarterly meetings. Automated system checks occasionally pinged dormant machines, so I categorized it as a misfire. The cooling ducts expanded with a faint tapping sound above the ceiling tiles, adjusting airflow as nighttime temperature dropped. I documented the failed attempt and returned to monitoring bandwidth. The following night, at nearly the same time, another login attempt originated from 2B. Again, invalid credentials. Again, guest admin. The pattern repeated on the third night. I pulled up the camera feed to 2B during one attempt. The room appeared empty, lights off, chairs tucked in. The workstation monitor was dark. On the second night, the camera feed dropped for exactly 4.2 seconds during the login attempt. Then it returned as if nothing had happened. Security confirmed no entry badge use during those windows. Exterior patrol logs showed no breach. The glass facade reflected empty parking lot lights and the occasional passing car on the distant road. If you appreciate slow-burn, realistic accounts like this, a like is enough. The attempts were always between 12:40 and 12:45 a.m., consistent to the minute. I checked the asset management system. The 2B workstation had never been formally disconnected from the network. It was drawing minimal standby power. That meant it could respond to remote wake signals under certain conditions. Reviewing environmental logs, I noticed the login attempts coincided with HVAC airflow cycle shifts. Pressure changed slightly when the building recalibrated temperature zones at night. It was technical enough to feel explainable, but the timing felt deliberate. I decided that on the next occurrence, I would physically inspect conference room 2B during the attempt window. When I left the server room and entered the stairwell, the door closed behind me with a hollow air pressure thud. At 12:42 a.m., I stood outside conference room 2B with the hallway lights off. Through the glass wall, the workstation monitor was black, reflecting only a faint outline of ceiling panels. The building felt contained, like air sealed in a jar. At 12:43, my tablet vibrated with a login alert. Simultaneously, the monitor inside 2B glowed faintly from sleep mode. The login screen appeared. No one was seated at the table. I watched carefully. The keyboard rested flat on the polished surface. Then, without visible hands, several keys depressed slightly, not forcefully, but enough that their edges dipped and returned. The movement was subtle, like pressure applied from above. The mouse cursor shifted across the login field. Not erratic, controlled. The low hum of air vents shifted overhead as the HVAC cycle adjusted. My tablet camera feed froze mid-frame. I opened the door and stepped inside. The monitor immediately returned to sleep mode. The cursor vanished. The keyboard lay still, but when I placed my fingertips lightly across the keys, they were slightly warm. The space bar sat fractionally lower than its housing, as if it had been pressed unevenly. The hallway behind me remained empty. No footsteps, no door movement, only conditioned air and fluorescent silence. I unplugged the workstation directly from the power strip and disconnected the Ethernet cable. I didn't reboot it. I didn't test it further. I documented the event in an internal anomaly report under Incident Reference IT 9034, detailing timestamps and observed physical movement. The data migration completed without further login attempts. For the remaining hours, no network irregularities occurred. Corporate later categorized the incident as a firmware glitch triggered by standby wake cycles during environmental shifts. The explanation was plausible enough to file away. When I unplugged the network cable, the silence in the room felt immediate and complete, as if something had been cut off beyond simple electricity. Weeks later, reviewing archived logs from home during a standard audit, I noticed a final login attempt recorded from the 2B workstation. The timestamp read 1:03 and 27 seconds AM, Sunday, 2 nights after I had unplugged and disconnected the device. Security logs showed the building fully armed at that time. No badge entries. No motion sensor triggers beyond routine perimeter patrol. The camera feed for 2B remained intact during that final attempt. No visible interference. No lighting changes. I remember sitting at my home office desk, the small fan spinning steadily at 1 AM, comparing timestamps twice to confirm they were not mismatched entries. I no longer accept solo overnight contracts in empty buildings. I don't believe in unexplained phenomena. I do believe that systems record input accurately when properly calibrated. Something interacted with that terminal without needing access, without needing a badge, without leaving a trace that I could prove. Conference room 2B remains assigned for quarterly meetings, but I'm told it's rarely used. I still remember the faint glow of that monitor in an otherwise dark building. If this account felt grounded to you, share it with someone who appreciates restrained horror, and subscribe for the next one told the same way.